Hi, I'm Kaylee, a librarian here at Mentor Public Library.
And I'm Meg, also a librarian, and welcome to this week's edition of All Booked Up with Kaylee and Meg, where each time we give you different book recommendations on a specific theme. Today, we are going to be looking at the world of true crime. So Kaylee and I were just talking about this, how true crime seems to be having a moment, whether it's streaming on Netflix or on TV or in books or just anywhere. Podcasts are pretty popular nowadays as well. People just want to know what is the truth behind a pretty mysterious story, which I think is pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we've always been fascinated by the salacious kind of things. I mean, There's a reason there's been so many different iterations of Law and Order. And those are ripped from the headlines.
Yeah.
I think that right now we are seeing a lot of great podcasts and books coming out that handle a lot of these crimes that maybe have gone under the news headlines a little bit. They haven't really been as spotlighted. And even the ones that have, I think that sometimes diving into a true crime book really opens up a lot of angles that you maybe didn't see before.
Absolutely.
So all of the books that we're going to talk about today are available for you here at the library, as well as online with your library card through Libby and Hoopla. So Meg, tell us about our first true crime.
So our first true crime, funnily enough, I'd probably call is it a crime? That's probably what I call it, because that's kind of part of the question in this book. It is called Dead Mountain, The Untold True Story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident by Dani Aichar. So this book took place, this is a historical, decades-long mystery that even to this day, people aren't for sure exactly what happened. So it's about a group of professional hikers who got lost in Russia's Ural Mountains, and they were found all killed at one time. And there's a lot, and no one knows what happened. But what is interesting about this story is there was quite a few suspicious circumstances around their death, which had caused people to think, is there foul play? Is there something a little more sinister involved in this story? So some of the things found at the scene of their death: unexplained violent injuries, okay? Signs that the hikers cut open and fled the tent without proper clothing or shoes. A strange final photograph taken by one of the hikers, and elevated levels of radiation found on some of their clothes. So all of these things were out of the norm, not typical for what you'd find, a lot of times hiking on a dangerous mountain. Yes, there's danger involved with that, but these were things that, seemed out of the norm. So the author, Dani Aichar, guides readers through unprecedented access to journal entries that haven't been revealed before, photographs, releasing government records, dozens of interviews with people who, either knew some of the hikers or were familiar with the geography of that mountain and everything. But he really also, what's interesting is the author kind of goes to the mountain himself, and he talks about that in the book, how he kind of retraces the hiker's steps and kind of his own thoughts that he gleans from his own journey doing that for maybe what they experienced. So it's a mystery of, if something nefarious happened, who did it, what happened? So there's some interesting theories proposed in this book, and I think the fun part is to kind of sort through them and decide for yourself what you think really happened.
Sounds really interesting, and it is always good when you find out that the author did so much research behind it, because you really feel like you're getting that insider access, especially when it talks about a place like this where it's such an unusual place that so many of us will have never been there.
Right.
But to get that insider perspective from the author really helps to build that story. And, it is an unsolved story too. So I like the fact that there are supposed answers that the author gives you. Interesting. My first book is Furious Hours: Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee by Casey Sepp. And I recently read this one, so it's fresh in my mind here. And it is kind of like 3 books in one. There is part true crime and two parts biography. One part true crime, two parts biography. That's what I'm going with. But even so, I think that the author does a great job of illuminating a crime that pretty much none of us had heard of before. So this is part biography of Harper Lee, who was the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, and also part biography of an attorney who she watched at trial, but part true crime. And the true crime story here presented is about the murder of Willie Maxwell, who was a supposed reverend from a southern town who was shot point blank at the funeral of his stepdaughter. Prior to this, Maxwell's friends and family surrounding him had a mysterious habit of dying under questionable circumstances.
No.
And so at the time of his death, Maxwell was suspected in the deaths of at least 5 people, including the stepdaughter whose funeral he was at, and all of whom he had life insurance policies on. Are you sensing a motive? The man who killed Maxwell was actually another relative. So this case itself is just kind of bonkers to me, because the fact that Willie Maxwell had been very seriously suspected of killing so many people and was still walking free, and to be at the funeral of one of those suspected victims is where he was killed. And despite being witnessed by so many people, the murderer who was put on trial was pleading not guilty. And this case was nationally covered, and this was in the late 70s. And it had attracted the attention of Harper Lee, who had several years earlier done the research for Truman Capote on his novel In Cold Blood. She had traveled with him to the small town where that it was a nonfiction book, was taking place. They had traveled to Kansas in order to research and investigate the crime that In Cold Blood is based on. And she had worked with him so much on this that she thought this crime, Willie Maxwell's story, was one that she could then use to write her own version, her own In Cold Blood, essentially. And she had helped so much with Truman Capote's notes and interviews and everything like that. She was in a good position to do so, and was present at a lot of the trials and interviewed a lot of the invested parties. Unfortunately, this book never came to be, because the only one we know for Harper Lee is To Kill a Mockingbird. But this story, Furious Hours, is fascinating in the way that it lays out all of the biographies of the people involved, basically, and tells you a lot about how Harper Lee got involved in this case, and how ultimately it panned out. So there's not so much mystery about it, but more kind of that, how could this have happened, especially when you start talking about insurance policies and this guy walking free, and how it got to the point where, what many considered a justified murder had to take place. And you learn a lot about the laws and the courts and everything like that, which is just very interesting story too.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Yeah, and that was like an education for me, because I didn't know that part of Harper Lee's life. I only really know about To Kill a Mockingbird. It sounds really interesting, and I also like you said, is talking about like the process of the justice system as well, how things can happen. I mean, I think of, shout out to my mom, loves Dateline. Like, she's just as interested in Keith Morrison and the host, and like how they go about, investigating and interviewing these people as well. So there's a whole fascination even with that aspect as well. So that's really cool. So my last true crime book I'm going to be talking about today is called The Babysitter: My Summers with a Serial Killer by Liza Rodman and Jennifer Jordan. So babysitter, you don't think of scary things when you think of that word, but in this book, that is not the case. So this is the chilling true story that follows a little girl longing for love who finds friendship with her charismatic babysitter, unaware that he's a vicious serial killer. I know. Growing up on Cape Cod in the 1960s, Liza Rodman was a lonely little girl during the summers while her mother worked days in a local motel and danced most nights in the Provincetown bars. Her babysitter, so to speak, the kind, handsome handyman who worked at the same motel that her mom did, he would drive her and her sister, to the park to get ice cream. Just mention taking them to his secret garden, which that doesn't sound too good, first of all. But anyway, what happens is Liza becomes to really like this guy because he's really one of the few adults that has ever shown her any kindness. She doesn't have really any friends, and she just feels alone. Her mom is kind of a absent figure in her life, so she really comes to trust this person. And then 1969 comes along, and his name is Tony Costa. I don't know if anyone knows it, but he was involved in headlines about these murders that happened in Massachusetts, 4 women who were killed, and he was connected with all of them. So as the story is really about how Liza, as an adult, because she didn't know this at first when it happened, she was kind of shielded from it. She comes to discover this, that this same person that she kind of admired and trusted as a young person is like a horrible person, and kind of how she dealt with that. I mean, because all the struggles she had in her childhood. So it's really thrilling. It kind of goes his perspective, Tony, the murder, like how the murders, were caught and on all of that. But then also this kind of heart-rending, tender aspect about this through the eyes of a child. Like, how is it from her perspective? All these crimes and kind of the duplicity of this person. So, it is heartbreaking, which obviously that's a big part of true crime, all these horrible things happening. But I appreciated that perspective from a child.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those things where it's like the person you least suspected.
Right.
So seeing it from the perspective of someone who did not know what was going on,
Yeah.
but only seeing that one side of someone who is truly evil in a way, like, that's an interesting way to take it,
Right.
So my last book to discuss today is sort of local for us. This is Unsolved Murders and Disappearances in Northeast Ohio by Jane Ann Terzillo. I'm going to say right away that I've met this author. She's very nice. She's come to the library. So I have a little bit of a bias in that way. But what I like about this book is it's really more of a collection of true crime stories, and it's right from our own neighborhoods. And I think there's something sort of extra creepy about reading a book where a major crime took place and you know where that is. You're familiar with that neighborhood.
Yeah.
So finding out something like that sort of brings that unease into your everyday life. And this is a shorter book too. It covers a bunch of different stories over probably a couple hundred years, I think. And the author does not dive too deep into any of these, especially because, as I said in the title, these are all unsolved cases. So for my unsolved mysteries fans, this helps scratch that itch a little bit. But Terzillo discusses cases that remain unsolved in this Northeast Ohio area. Some of them are a little more familiar with people. There was a case of 2 Parma teachers who were on their way to school on a winter day and were attacked and bludgeoned to death. No one was ever arrested in that case. There's also another case involving what appeared to be a suicide and was later to be deemed murder, and there's been no arrests. There's some interesting cases that take place on the railways of Ohio, and all sorts of things here. So this is one where you can obviously read about one particular case that's interesting to you, jump around a little bit, or read the book straight through. And the author does a great job of sharing a lot of local sources for the materials too, so that you are familiar with, where these things came from. And some of these cases might be brand new to you, even if you're from this area, especially the older ones. But some of them, might ring true, as you might have seen them in the headlines yourself. So I think that's also part of sort of the allure of a lot of true crime, and why some of these cases really do go into national or international papers, is sometimes they really do catch your attention, especially in their unsolved nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And the local aspect, I mean, every time they say it would never happen in our town or never in our area, just gives me the chills, because it feels like everyone says that, So yeah, it's definitely interesting to see what's going on in this area over the years. I don't know hardly any of them. So I think if you watched all the shows, if you read all the books, maybe you'll be enlightened in this one. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this week's edition of All Booked Up with Kaylee and Meg. We hope you got some good recommendations that hopefully can satisfy your mystery solving urge.
Join us next time. Happy reading.